So for the majority of spiritual seekers, they are at this kind of first stage, which is what I call the in and out stage.
Yes.
And the in and out stage is where there has been some truth that's been realized, some glimpse of one's true nature, some glimpse of how reality is, which is really the same thing. To see life as it is also to see ourselves as we are. To see ourselves as we are is also to see life as it is. They're really one and the same, because our true nature is life. So in this first stage, what we can call a glimpse or a particular realization or a particular epiphany, this is where either we have seen our true face beyond this personal limited sense of self, or it is where we've seen through a particular illusion. We've seen through the illusion of time, and so we've had a taste of timelessness as an example. Really, they go hand in hand. Seeing the untruth, we see a truth. Seeing the truth, we see an untruth. So many beings have had this kind of initial glimpse, this initial awakening, like a flash of realization. But what many beings find is that they're kind of in and out of that. It's like they oscillate between this feeling of the peace and fulfillment of their true nature and having this kind of clarity, and then they kind of fall back into the unconscious patterns of the limited sense of self. So they're kind of in and out of that. The next stage, which is self-realization, full self-realization. Self-realization means obviously to realize the self, to realize the big self, the capital S, not the little self, not the ego, not the false I, but the true I, the real self. The true I is the letter I, and the letter I is the number one. The letter I is the number one. So the true I is the one, the ultimate one, the ultimate self, the true self, the supreme self. The false I is where a being has identified themselves as being just a body and a mind. When they identify themselves as just being a body and a mind, they fall from the direct experience of the Supreme Self into a very limited and contracted experience. In a sense of time, feeling like a personal separate self, feeling a sense of emptiness, as if something is missing, as if something is lacking. So self-realization, this next stage, is to fully recognize and see clearly that I am this big self, this unlimited self, boundless self, and I am not the little self. To see the little self is an illusion. And it's to also see all of the illusions that come along with thinking that we are this little self. The illusion of time, the illusion of separation, the illusion of lack, of scarcity. The illusion of unworthiness. in seeing what we really are, we see obviously that all of that is untrue, because we recognize in the Supreme Self that we are that it is always full, that it is inherently worthy, that it is a oneness, that it is unbounded. And so in this full self-realization, we become established in that big self. There is a permanent shift that happens in which we are always this Supreme Self. We've sort of stepped out of this limited sense of self. We've dissolved this limited sense of self, the false self, the false I, in which we're always now being this supreme true self. Enlightenment is different. Enlightenment is the next stage. The word enlightenment means illumination of the mind. The word ment is a Latin word which means mind. So enlightenment is the illumination of the mind. The mind is not just a thought or thinking. The mind is the whole body. The whole human organism is like mind. So it is the illumination of this body-mind complex. And enlightenment is different than self-realization because it takes the realization a step further. It's not just that we've realized the truth and what is false, but it is that we've now brought this divinity of this true eternal self into an embodied living of that. And it is also that all of the karma, this kind of residue, these imprints, these deep tendencies, what they call in the yogic system, the vasanas, the deep tendencies. Enlightenment is where all of that has dissolved. In other words, this kind of karmic momentum that the soul was carrying, which is the soul mind, has now become enlightened. Enlightenment, that mind, that soul mind has become enlightened. It's become free of these karmic tendencies, these imprints, in which then it's free from past karma and it no longer incurs or takes on new karma. Karma is a Sanskrit word which means action, but more deeply, karma taken on happens through identification with the action, in which we think we are the doer. When an action happens, if we think I'm the one that made that action happen, or I am subject to this action, which is really to say that we think we are the body-mind, this separate person, then what happens is we take on new karma. We're holding on to past karma and then we're taking on new karma. So enlightenment is that we have dissolved this karma. In self-realization, even though we are now established as this true self, which means that we're looking always from beyond the mind. We're no longer in the mind. We are always in the present, looking from the present. Even in that position, the karma, these deep karmic tendencies can still be arising. They still play themselves out because there's a momentum of it. So because of that, there is not the full ability yet to become a true divine expression in the body-mind. Which is to say that we're not able to reach our full potential. Enlightenment is where we can reach full potential in terms of this particular body-mind incarnation. And there's even the soul mind. In self-realization, that's not possible yet. So in enlightenment, it means that not only are we established as this true supreme self, but now all of this karmic stuff has kind of played itself out. And we're free from that karma, we're no longer incurring new karma, and that karma is not interfering with the ability to be a divine expression of this supreme self that we've realized. And this is the difference between what we would call an enlightened being versus just a self-realized being. The self-realized being, that's a huge, huge step that most beings have not taken. Enlightenment is another step. There are even fewer beings that are a true, true divine expression of that. We can maybe count a handful of them throughout history. Prominent ones, there are more than that. Some modern day. But it's much rarer than even just the self-realization. This is what they call in some of the Eastern traditions, they call it a jivan mukti. When a being has enlightened, they are then a jivan mukti, which means, mukti means freedom. So it means that they are free. Jivan means soul. So a jivan mukti is a free soul, liberated soul. It means that while a being is still incarnated, they are free. Free from all karma, free from all cycles. The final stage is liberation. Liberation is, in its deepest and fullest form, is freedom of the soul completely, in which it has merged fully back into the absolute source of all that is, and is completely free to move or to move as it is. Whereas in self-realization, that's not necessarily the case, because it's not fully gone through and dissolved all of its karmic tendencies. So really, until we are enlightened, it's not possible to reach our full potential. We're not able to fully access the full range of what is possible. Before we get to that point, we have to go through self-realization. We have to be absolutely clear, not mentally, but experientially clear. We have to be experientially clear on what we are and what we're not. And to be that, to be established in that position beyond the mind. Because infinite possibilities, the 0 point, if you will, the wave function, as they call it in science, to access the infinite wave function of pure potentiality, of infinite possibilities, that cannot happen until we step out of the mind. And the reason for that is because the collapsing of the wave function, as they call it in science, happens when an observer is looking at something, which really means not just looking, it means thinking about something. In other words, if we are still a mind, if we are still mind identified, if we're still in the mind, then what is happening is that we are just collapsing the wave function, which means we are manifesting reality as it has always been, or in a certain pattern, a certain way, because we're stuck in that pattern. We're stuck in that mind, which is just perpetual patterns. In other words, there's no ability to reset. To reset means we have to step out of the mind. When we step out of the mind, we go from the collapsing of the wave function back into infinite possibilities, in which something new can come about. A new potential. This is again how it's tied with the karma, right? So even more so in enlightenment, because now that karma has dissolved, even more strongly now there is the possibility in each and every moment to be tapping into this 0 point field of infinite possibilities in which something new can happen each and every time. In other words, there's no longer the possibility of being stuck in certain patterns, in repetitive patterns. There's no longer the ability of being stuck in a Groundhog Day. Whereas as long as we're in the mind, to some degree, there is this, we're stuck in certain patterns. And yes, maybe every now and again there is the possibility to step out of the mind on the brief occasion and collapse the reality into something slightly different. But for a true change, a true transformation, there has to be this awakening beyond the mind. This is something that's not often talked about in a lot of spiritual videos, teachings that you hear, especially those people that are manifestation type teachers or people. They just jump straight into, oh, you as this personal limited sense of self, this illusion, this ego self, you can manifest what you want and you can be a creator and create this, create that. When the truth really is that all an ego can do is unconsciously create. Unconsciously creates what its previous karma is. Because it's trapped inside of its own mind, it's trapped inside of its own unconscious tendencies and behaviors. So it it has very little, if any, ability to do anything differently. If something different does happen, it's not because the ego has done it. It's because the forces of life have changed something, maybe astrologically. And then people go, oh, look, I did it. I manifested this. No, it was going to manifest anyway, more than likely, because the flow of life was going to manifest it anyway. A lot of things that people think I manifested was just going to happen anyway. And a lot of proof of that is because there's lots of things that a person tries to manifest and then it doesn't happen. Those ones people discount, but the ones that do happen, they say, oh, I did it, see? What we must understand is that the majority of people's life and what plays out for them, their destiny, is predetermined. It's predetermined by the previous karma. And what's the previous karma determined by? It's determined by the action that has been taken to create that. But that action that was taken was created through unconsciousness, which means that that individual thought that they were something that they are not. So they took an action from an unconscious state of thinking that they were an illusion, which is to say, this separate, limited sense of self. So this is how it becomes a trap. It's really a trap of the mind, a trap of identity, a trap of attachments. So most of what is playing out for people in their life is predetermined, it's predestined by their previously created karma, which was created by being in a state of unconsciousness. When we step out of the mind, we become conscious. Only from that consciousness can something new be created. It's like if we imagine if you turn a bicycle upside down and you take one of the wheels and you spin it, and you keep spinning it and keep spinning it and keep spinning it. Well, of course, if you keep spinning it, it's just going to keep spinning and spinning and spinning. It builds up a momentum to the point where you could even stop spinning it and it will keep going for quite a while. This is this cycle, the wheel of samsara, as it has been called in Buddhism. That's the karmic wheel. So what we have to do is we have to stop spinning it, which means we have to stop identifying and believing something. We have to stop going with the mind in its usual tendencies, its usual patterns. If we don't do that, it just keeps building momentum, which is just creating more and more karma, strengthening more and more karma. And for most beings, this is all happening unconsciously. They're not even aware at all that that's what's taking place. And then when something happens, they say, oh, that was, I did it, or it happened randomly. When really it was based on a previous action that was taken unconsciously. This is what happens, what we're saying in self-realization. As I said earlier, in self-realization, it's like you're taking a step back from that wheel. You're no longer spinning the wheel. So in self-realization, you've stepped back. You're no longer spinning the wheel. However, the wheel has a momentum, so it will continue. So even as a self-realized being, that self-realized being can still be experiencing all of its past karmic stuff coming up, in which now that a being is realized, they're established in their true nature, but yet they're still witnessing the whole play of all of this karmic stuff coming up. It has to play itself out. It has to dissolve itself. It has to exhaust itself. So it gets slower and slower and slower. Enlightenment is where that wheel has stopped. The wheel has stopped altogether. And now that the wheel has stopped altogether, what you are left with always is pure infinite potentiality, pure infinite possibilities. Every moment is then a pure infinite potentiality and possibility for that being. The truth is that life is always that. Life is always this pure infinite potentiality, but most beings don't experience it in that way because their mind, as an observer, as a thinker, is constantly collapsing the wave function all the time based on its previous karma, based on its thought patterns. So it never is able to access infinite possibilities. It's only able to repeat its past karmic tendencies. And this is why there's always been a lot of debate about free will, predestination, and all of that. Because in a sense, both are true. Predestination is true. Predetermination is true because if a being is stuck in that past karma, then all they can do is repeat that. So therefore it's predetermined. There is no conscious free will. Their life is just a series of karmic events of a momentum created by the so-called past, which again is really happening now, because it's happening at the soul level, which is here and now. The soul has got these imprints in which it's playing out in the moment. It's playing out karmic tendencies. And the free will is only when a being is fully conscious. Only an enlightened being has free will. But at that stage of enlightenment, it's no longer individual will, it's one will. It's not my will, it is thy will. As it says in the Bible, thy will be done. It is not my will, it is thy will. It is the one will, it is the supreme one universe's will. Because now that enlightened being has just become a pure vessel, conduit for the absolute will to operate through it. So really the truth is that the ego never has any free will, and it can't have any free will. It can only be predetermined, because the ego itself is made of thought. The ego itself is made of this programming. It's mind, it's just memory. So the ego itself is like karma. So there's no way that the ego can have true free will. The only way is to wake up beyond the ego, and then when one wakes up beyond the ego, they are no longer this ego self. They're no longer a personal will. Now they're the one will. And at that point, it's not like there is an individual that's saying, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. It's different. It's very, very different. At that point, you are the supreme. And the Supreme is the one that is determining and has the impulse to do this or to do that. But it's not that there is a personal somebody saying, I'm going to do this and do that. So this is why there's been such debate between this predestination, free will, fate, destiny, etc. Because they are both true to a certain level. The free will is not the free will of the individual, even though it will appear like that, meaning this individual body. The free will is the free will of the one infinite source itself. Only the one infinite source has true free will. But a being that is enlightened to that, they have then free will. They have the free will of the one, of the absolute. It's not a personal free will. So these are the kind of four main phases or stages that we move through. The first is this in and out stage of having a glimpse, having a realization, an epiphany, seeing our true face for the first time, what they call in Zen a satori, called a flash of awakening or a flash of enlightenment. We see what we are. We see through an illusion. But then we kind of fall back into this pattern of the unconscious, limited mind, thinking we are a personal sense of self again. And for that, in that phase, a being is in and out, in and out, in and out. And so they're up one moment, down the next, up one moment, down the next. If anything, it becomes more polarizing than a being that had never had a glimpse. The being that never had a glimpse, they're just unconsciously in this up and down pattern, but to them it's kind of normal. And so it doesn't have the same kind of extremity to it. The being that has had that first glimpse, they have more of an extremity in their ups and downs because they've now seen the contrast. They've now felt the contrast. They've felt the contrast between their true nature, the peace, the joy, the freedom of that, and between the limitedness and the unhappiness and the depression and whatever comes else with that contracted state. So they feel it even more. This is why often people will say that as they become more conscious, as they are meditating more, becoming more self-aware, it's like their mind gets busier. And really what's happening, it's not that their mind is actually getting more busy. It's that now they're noticing the busyness of it for the first time. In other words, they've now shone a light on it. It's now been highlighted. It's now been emphasized. Whereas before, it was kind of going on. They were in the middle of it and it was going on to the point where they didn't really notice it. But now that they've created a bit of space from it, they notice it even more. So being in that in-between phase is one of the most challenging phases you can be in. Because you've begun, but you've not finished. As the Buddha himself said, there's only two mistakes on the path: to not begin and to not finish. So that in-between place where most spiritual seekers are is one of the most challenging places. The joy and the bliss is better than you've ever experienced before. The highs are higher than you could experience before, but now the lows are even lower. You can fall even further. So that should be an incentive to any being to make it all the way into full self-realization. And then in full self-realization, you no longer suffer. The suffering has come to an end. You've cleared up the illusions. However, the karma will still play itself out. Certain tendencies, certain patterns may still play themselves out, but you're not identified with them anymore. It's like you're watching them. You're watching them playing. You catch it. Ah, right, I see. But you're not suffering it anymore. Because the sufferer, which is that separate sense of self, has dissolved. It is no more. So now there's no ability to suffer anymore. So there is a freedom from suffering. But it's not played itself out to its fullest degree until the enlightenment happens, in which all of these cycles have played themselves out. They've burnt themselves out. And then at that point, it really is true freedom, or a deeper level of freedom. Because you could then say that liberation, which is the leaving of the body, is the ultimate freedom. And so that's what's been called ultimate liberation. The final liberation, in which the soul itself, this soul-mind vehicle, returns back fully to the infinite source itself. It's completely free. So it's like different levels of freedom that are being realized, going deeper and deeper and deeper. Okay, so I'll bring you back in now. If you want to put your mic back on.
That was amazing. That's exactly where I am right now.